The Arkansas Razorbacks are going to have a new quarterback, a new coaching staff, a brand new defense going into 2026. Why is that? Well, 2025 was horrific. Sam Pittman was on the hot seat for the last 3 years. Arkansas finally decides to pull the trigger in the middle of the season. Bobby Petrino had recently come in to be the offensive coordinator. He takes over as interim head coach, and I really did think that he was going to come back into Arkansas after being disgracefully fired back in the late 2000s. After the affair motorcycle accident incident. I thought he was going to come back into Arkansas and retake over this program, but it seems that the Razorbacks wanted to go with a younger, newer face to stabilize the program and keep seasons like this from happening. The defense was atrocious. Arkansas had probably the worst Power 4 defense in the country. They were 130th in scoring defense, 113th in red zone scoring defensive efficiency. They could not get the ball away from other offenses. They were 129th in takeaways. Offensively, though, this was a great program. They were 23rd in the country in scoring, third in the country in yards per carry. They could run the ball like nobody's business. Bobby Petrino had this offense steady cooking the entire year, but it was not enough to stave the horrible defensive performances over and over again. They had a lot of close losses if you look here at the schedule. One possession loss to Ole Miss, Memphis, Tennessee, Texas A&M. It was a very close game versus Auburn. One possession loss to Mississippi State, LSU. They could not stop scoring on Texas. And then last but certainly not least, a horrible home loss to Missouri, a kind of rival for Arkansas to close out the year. And that was all that she wrote for Bobby Petrino and his comeback kid story at Arkansas. He moves on to be the offensive coordinator at North Carolina with Bill Belichick. I thought that was a very curious hire, but that being said, Arkansas needed an entire new face of the franchise here. Who do they hire? Well, they went with a kind of safe pick here in Ryan Silverfield, the head coach at Memphis. Now, he's had an outstanding career at Memphis. I wouldn't say a great one, though. He's not one of the great group of 5 coaches. I think he's very good. He went 50-25 at Memphis, which is very commendable, but never won a conference title there. When you have a coach that goes from the group of 5 to the Power 4, you want to see them have multiple 12-plus win seasons consistently, not off and on. So Silverfield didn't necessarily, light the fire under me that had me fired up for Arkansas football, but a safe hire nonetheless. They're trying to stabilize this program, and I think that they can do that under Silverfield, who brings in his offensive coordinator at Memphis, Tim Cramsey, to be the OC here. Not exactly sure who was calling the plays at Memphis, but I do know Silverfield is an offensive guy. He is the creator of this offense, so we're going to be, finding out what that looks like when it comes to playing against SEC competition. Now, they were able to win games at Memphis against Power 4 competition over the last few years. As you can see, they beat Arkansas. Now, that was due to a kind of a fluky turnover at the end of that game there for Memphis, but that being said, really excited to see what Silverfield can do. Can he stabilize this program? It's absolutely possible. But the best hire of this staff that I have to tip my cap to is Ron Roberts on the defensive side of the football. He's going to be the defensive coordinator. He comes in from Florida. Now, if you go back and look at Florida's record over the last couple seasons, it hasn't been great. But the defense has. Ron Roberts has an extremely underrated resume as the defensive coordinator of Florida. If you go back and watch those games versus Texas A&M and LSU and a few of those other teams from last season, the defense was not the problem. It was the offense. Go back and watch that LSU game where DJ Lagway had 5 turnovers. Ron Roberts and that defense were having to put up a gargantuan effort to keep Florida competitive in that football game. Now, that's the coaching staff. Let's talk about some of the transfers out of this program, as well as some of the NFL draft picks, and then we'll get into what the new roster looks like. So for starters in the transfer portal, we're going to scroll back up here, and we're going to start with a guy that is kind of mysterious, in my opinion. Let's see here, Keyshawn Blackstock. Now, this was a 9-game starter on the offensive line last year, 10-game starter on the defensive line just 2 years ago. Played both sides of the football, both at Arkansas and I believe at Michigan State, where he originally transferred into Arkansas from. He entered the transfer portal. He was a redshirt senior last year. Not sure if this is like an eligibility thing. I haven't seen any record of him transferring anywhere. He might have just run out of eligibility or retired from football. Let me know if you have any information about this guy. Very curious to see what's going on with him. But then we'll scroll down and we'll talk about another guy that I think is a really integral part of this offensive line from last year that was extremely successful. Marion Harris, who looks to be the projected tackle starter for Oklahoma. He was, I believe, let me check my notes here, 24 games started for Arkansas. This offensive line, Sam Pittman, he does one thing well, and that's build a great offensive line. Arkansas has been able to run the football pretty consistently throughout Pittman's tenure, and Bobby Petrino used that to the absolute best possible ability that he could last year. Marion Harris, great player. He's going to be really standout guy at Oklahoma. I'll be sure to talk about him when I talk about Oklahoma. But let's move on and let's talk about the last guy, the crucial transfer from this defensive line last year, and that's Ian Gifford, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He played 26 total games with Arkansas, 12 starts from last year, 4 tackles for loss, multiple quarterback hurries and pressures. Really interested to see how he ends up at Texas. That is a stacked defensive line. Gifford was the standout guy in this front seven from last year. I really want to see him shine at Texas, but a shame that Arkansas lost him to the transfer portal. Now let's talk about the NFL prospects. Offensively, there were a ton. I'll highlight first in the backfield, Mike Washington Jr. and Taylon Green. Washington had 1,300 scrimmage yards and 9 touchdowns and was top 5 in the country in yards per carry for qualified backs at 6.4 yards per carry. Anytime he touched the rock, it was damn near half of a first down. It was a great time. I had a great time watching this guy play. He's extremely explosive. Now we move on to Taylon Green, who doesn't really have the brightest of prospects in the NFL, but was unbelievable in college. 2,700 yards in the air, and then 777 rush yards, 27 total touchdowns. Really impressed from Green and his production at Arkansas, despite the lackluster prospects at wide receiver. Now we talk about the rest of this roster here. There's one more player that I want to highlight, Fernando Carmona from the offensive line. Once again, this was an offensive line that was stacked and ran the ball at an unbelievable rate. Carmona is yet another guy that they're going to be missing, a 25-game starter, second team All-SEC last year. They're going to miss Carmona and a couple of other offensive linemen that leave in the transfer portal and from the NFL. Let's go ahead and talk about now, though, the transfers in to this program. Actually, let's go ahead and talk about the returning production. There's a couple guys that are worth the highlight here. Offensively, it's Kobe Barnham and Caden Kittler. Both of these guys full-time starters last year for the offense. They're going to have to anchor down what looks to be a new offensive line for the rest of this group. We got a ton of transfers in. And then in the backfield, Braylon Russell, who's been around with the program for the last couple of seasons. I really thought he was going to have the shine last year, but Mike Washington comes in from, I believe, Utah and takes over that starting position. Braylon Russell in year 3, I am very confident that he can return to his freshman production as well as just continue to excel and punch on the gas pedal, especially with a couple of guys from last year's offensive line. Braylon Russell is going to be somebody that I'm relying on to have some of that really talented production for this Arkansas offense, who, like I said, is, bringing in a lot of new guys into the skill group position like Ty Lockwood, Donovan Fappel, Chris Marshall, Jamari Hawkins as well. So Braylon Russell, somebody to watch out for. Now, defensively, there's one guy that I want to talk about, Bradley Shaw, who is the returning middle linebacker from last season. He was a 7-game starter. He had, I believe, 24 solo tackles, 5 tackles for loss. He's going to be, I think, the play caller for this defense, at least the guy with the audio set in his headset for this new Ron Roberts defense. Really interested to see how he fits into this, what looks to be a I believe it's like a 3-3-5 defense. You got 2 middle linebackers, a jack linebacker, as well as a defensive end, nose tackle, D tackle. It might honestly be like a configuration of a 4-2-5. Haven't actually diagnosed the Florida defense that much, but that's kind of what it looks to be with two edge rushers here in Charlie Collins and Quincy Rhodes, two linebackers in the middle. Maybe Kamori House will be the defensive play caller from North Carolina and Washington, I believe. Let me double check my notes here. Yeah, we'll talk about him in just a little bit. But then 5 defensive backs, a nickel back, of course. I mean, who doesn't run nickel in college these days? So that being said, let's talk about some of the transfers in. Offensively, there are a couple guys that I want to talk about. Davion Witherspoon, who's currently in the 2 deep here. He was first team All-MAC transferring in from Ohio. He's a 27-game starter. I actually believe that he will become the starter on this offensive line. There's a lot of new jobs to take over here on the offensive line, and maybe Witherspoon can be one of those new starters. That's somebody of note. But defensively, in the defensive back group, where Ron Roberts truly excels, tons of talented defensive backs come out of Florida, and Roberts was cooking. I think he'll do the same here. Jaheim Johnson comes from Tulane, 28 games played, 14 games started, 32 tackles, 9 passes deflected last year, 4 interceptions. He's going to have to be a guy that takes over that Julian Neal role on the defensive side of the football. Carter Stoutmeyer, I believe is how you pronounce his name. He comes in from Colorado, 30 games played, 16 starts. He's going to be the free safety for this team. This guy is going to have to be the anchor on the back end. He had, I believe, let's take a look here, 23 tackles in just 7 games. I believe he missed some with injury last season. He's going to be the run stopper for the secondary. And then last but certainly not least, I already mentioned him a little bit, Kamori House comes from North Carolina, where he followed Stephen Belichick, the defensive coordinator for North Carolina, obviously Bill Belichick's son, who was previously the defensive coordinator at Washington. So House has been all around the country now, Washington to North Carolina, now to the middle of the country in Arkansas. 45 tackles last season. Really impressive production from him. There's a lot of other guys that I could touch on that I think are going to have a big impact or potentially could. Former 4-stars like Zadavian Sims, I believe, who transfers in from Oregon. These are guys that have a lot of potential, but haven't really seen the field yet. So this is a stacked roster in terms of former talent, as well as some guys that have had a decent amount of production, but stacked is a relative term, right? You're playing in the SEC against SEC competition. Do I think this roster stacks up against other SEC rosters? Probably not, but this is definitely an offense and defense that can pull off an upset or two, depending on how the schedule lays out for them. Last but certainly not least on the transfers end, the guy that I want to talk about, who I believe is going to be in a quarterback battle with backup quarterback last year, KJ Jackson, AJ Hill, who was a former 4-star, committed to Memphis under Ryan Silverfield. If I had to guess, I would say Hill will probably end up being the starter, but don't get me wrong, this is a pretty evened out quarterback competition. Would not be surprised if both of these guys end up playing throughout the season. That being said, that's your Arkansas roster. Let's go ahead and flip to the schedule, and I'm going to talk about a few storylines that I'm going to watch here for this Arkansas team. For starters, reestablishing the run game. Like I said, Arkansas was 3rd in the country last year in yards per carry. They could run the ball like no other team in the SEC. I really want to see them return to that production. Running the football is honestly the core for any winning national championship team. It's very seldom that you see high volume passing offenses end up winning the national championship. They all lean on the run game. Even that explosive offense back in 2020 and 2019 with LSU and Alabama taking home the Natties, those teams still leaned on guys like Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Najee Harris in the backfield. The run game is so important. So they've got to reestablish the run. They probably won't be 3rd in the country in yards per carry again, but if they can get into the top 25 and then improve their passing statistics as well as their defensive performance, they could be far more competitive. Second thing I want to watch out for is, what does this complete overhaul of the defense look like under Ron Roberts? In my opinion, this was the worst defense in the country last year. Maybe not the worst defense in the Power 4, and then I'll say maybe the country. Arkansas could not stop a nosebleed, even if their life was on the line. It was horrific to watch them play. I will say they have made a lot of impact transfers. The new scheme should be a little helpful. I am worried that a 4-2-5 with, instead of another defensive lineman, you bring in a jack linebacker. I'm worried what that's going to look like against physical, run-heavy teams in the SEC, especially now given that you have to play 9 conference games. But that being said, the last storyline that, of course, you could watch out for is the battle between KJ Jackson and AJ Hill. The quarterback is going to be blank. I'm not exactly sure who it's going to be. As I've said, I believe Jackson on paper currently has the upper hand, but Hill has that rapport, with the head coaching or just the coaching staff in general, offensive coordinator, I believe the quarterback's coach as well, who actually, and as a matter of fact, I believe Arkansas had to make a new quarterback's coach hire after their quarterback's coach, who came with them from Memphis, ended up becoming the offensive coordinator at Maryland. Could be wrong about that, but that's what I'm remembering off the top of my head. So anyways, the 3 storylines to watch out for are reestablishing the run game, the overhaul of this defense, and the quarterback battle between Jackson and Hill. The keys to improvement, you got to take the ball away. Just honestly improve overall defensively. Of course, you have to protect the quarterback. They didn't really do a great job of that last year, but it was just because they were running the ball so much. But in my opinion, the most important key to improvement is taking the ball away. They were 129th in the country, worse in the SEC in takeaways last year, and they were 118th in the country in giveaways. So this is one of the worst turnover differential teams in the country going into 2026. If they can close that gap and lower their margin of loss there, they can absolutely be more competitive in these games. And we go back and look at some of these games versus Ole Miss, Memphis, Tennessee, Mississippi State, LSU. They're all one-possession games. If you give yourself an extra possession or two by either A, not turning the ball over, or B, taking the ball away, you win a lot of those games. And maybe we're talking about Sam Pittman going into year 7, I believe. That being said, let's take a look at the schedule. It's going to be extremely tough. 9 conference games and a road game in the non-conference. That is a miserable start for Arkansas. I think that they get the dub over North Alabama. There's not really a think, it's more of a no. I know they're going to beat North Alabama. Then on the road at Utah, that's a really tough game. They're also going through a coaching overhaul, but they have a lot more continuity and consistency, which in my opinion is important for the entire season, but extremely important for the beginning of the year. You gotta have continuity and consistency to be successful in competitive games early on in the season. Then you've got Georgia at home. I think that's a loss. I don't think I actually said a full prediction. I don't think they beat Utah, even though they're also going through a coaching overhaul. So back-to-back losses there. Home for Tulsa should be an easier win. Would not be surprised if Tulsa was able to keep that game competitive in the first half. But then at Texas A&M, I don't think this will be as competitive as last year. A&M has got a lot of returning production. Mike Elko has that defense as one of the best in the country. They were number 1 in sacks last season. I think they'll put a lot of pressure on what looks to be a pretty green quarterback room with Hill and Jackson, I believe, not starting any games prior to this year. Then you got Tennessee at home. This is my first upset alert. Tennessee has struggled a little bit on both sides of the football throughout the season. They actually were spoiled versus Arkansas at home for Arkansas just 2 seasons ago. I think Arkansas could get it done again, but I will go with Josh Heupel on this one and call this officially a loss. At Vanderbilt, yet another winnable game. Vanderbilt has one of the worst talent compositions in the conference, although Arkansas is probably a little bit worse, honestly. With this game being on the road, I have to lean Vanderbilt, but once again, would not be surprised if Arkansas was able to pull off an upset here. Home for Missouri. Now, this game with the bye week after Vanderbilt, this is where they get their big dub. This is the upset alert that I'm talking about here. I'm calling out a lot of upsets just because I want to be on top of potential upsets, but this one is the one that I am predicting. With the week off, being well rested, being at home, Missouri also going through a grueling SEC conference schedule. I think that they might slip up here and lose to Arkansas at home. I think Arkansas is good enough to beat Missouri. A lot of people are saying that they're sleeping, or fans are sleeping on Missouri. I kind of agree, but this is just a really tough spot at the end of October. But then you follow that up at Auburn. I think Auburn's offense is going to be really physical. This Auburn team kind of reminds me of Arkansas's offense from last season. However, I think Auburn's defense is much more productive / stout than Arkansas's was last year. And so this game being on the road in Jordan-Hare, I don't think it's terribly competitive. I think Auburn takes that one. Home for South Carolina. This is another upset alert that I'm calling. I think that they'll win that game at home. Lenore Sellers is projected to be one of the best quarterbacks in the country. However, he's had a pretty up and down career. It seems that they are far more reliant on his athletic ability. And this late in the season, I think there's going to be a lot of tape on them. Ron Roberts should be able to drop a great scheme to shut him and wide receivers like Nick Harbor down. I think Arkansas actually gets this upset at home. But then you follow that up with a rivalry game versus LSU. I'll always put an upset alert tag on a rivalry game versus LSU at Texas, though. I do not expect Arkansas to be terribly competitive. Arch Manning, having Cam Coleman, and a bunch of other talent on this offense. This team is competing for national championships. Arkansas is trying to compete to get into a bowl game here. They're on two different paths. LSU, I say the same thing, but this is a home game for Arkansas. It's a rivalry game. You know how those go. I mean, LSU almost lost that one last year. Arkansas has been fairly competitive in those games versus LSU over the last 5 or 6 years. So I definitely think that could end up being a upset alert-esque game, but I will lean LSU there as an official prediction. So as a floor, I have Arkansas going 2-10. I absolutely think Missouri can beat Arkansas. I know Vanderbilt can. I know South Carolina can beat Arkansas. I don't think North Alabama or Tulsa is pulling off an upset. So 2-10 is the absolute floor. The ceiling, in my opinion, is 6-6. 7-5 is just too lofty. You would have to win multiple games versus Utah, Georgia, Texas A&M, Tennessee, on the road at Auburn, Texas, and LSU. You'd have to win probably 2 of those games and pull off upsets versus South Carolina and Missouri. I don't see that happening. My full-on prediction is 4-8. So dubs against North Alabama, Tulsa, Missouri, and South Carolina, and that's it. I don't see any road victories here for Arkansas, even though they don't have to play like a road trip-esque schedule. The road games are just going to be hard to win. 4-8 is my final prediction. Let me know what you think of this preview. Do you like Arkansas this year? Are we sleeping on them? I definitely don't think so. This Arkansas team is going to have a hard time rebounding from 2-10, going into maybe 5-7 or 4-8. So that being said, thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know other teams that you're curious to know about, and be sure to tune in for the next episode. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.